make something of herself.
She had a tough go of it at the start.
She wanted to do better than the circumstances that she was brought into.
And on her path to success, she met a more mature man who shared her ambitions.
He says, I love you. I want to make a life with you.
He filled that void that a man of her age couldn't give her.
But their May-December romance is abruptly cut short.
It had to be kind of shocking to find out from a social media post that your loved one is missing.
Why weren't we told about this sooner?
Did she fall prey to a troubled past?
He mentions this male, goes by the name of Bear.
They're goons, they're killers, they don't play.
Or did a strange obsession lead to deadly consequences?
He would watch her on his camera. She had no idea that he was living two lives.
Something's in there, man.
It's only a few weeks away from Thanksgiving in Cleveland, Ohio.
In the city of Cleveland, a lot of people look forward to Thanksgiving because it reminds people of family. It gives us a chance to kind of huddle together and have kind of a respite from the day-to-day grinds of society.
The leaves are turning. People are getting prepared to have their meals, and there's just a sense of excitement in the air.
Cleveland resident Candy Moore is no exception. But on this chilly Saturday morning, as she's scrolling through social media, Candy sees a post that takes her breath away.
It's an Instagram post from the account Cleveland Remembrance page. It's kind of like an unofficial neighborhood news source.
The post mentions Candy's niece, 23-year-old Adriana Taylor.
Adriana Taylor is missing.
The post was from some friends that had given the page information that she'd been missing for quite some time.
But this is the first time Candy is hearing about Adriana's disappearance.
It had to be kind of shocking to find out from a social media post that your loved one is missing.
At the time that the aunt finally saw the information, her niece had been missing almost 30 days.
Concerned by what she's just read, Candy tries to contact Adriana, but her calls go straight to voicemail.
That alarmed her.
She thought something was going on that wasn't right.
Your mind is spiraling. You're trying to figure out exactly how this could ever happen to you or your family member and how to fix it as quickly as possible.
23-year-old Adriana Taylor grabbed attention wherever she went.
Her smile, her heart, she would talk to everybody, make everybody feel good. She was fun.
She was such a loving and supportive person to the people that were around her.
She was very generous. She would give you the shirt off her back.
Adriana's inner light was all the more remarkable given her upbringing.
She didn't have the easiest of lives.
The parents weren't really in the picture all that much. She bounced around from family and friends.
Adriana was one of 6 kids and pretty much was raised by her grandparents.
It's common for people who don't have that relationship or that bond with their parents to not be able to flourish, but Adriana was able to beat those odds.
She had been through some things, but had come out on top with a good heart and a good spirit.
As soon as she was able, Adriana joined the workforce.
She had a job at the distribution plant. She was a hard worker.
She was out here trying to make a better life for herself by making an honest living.
Adriana really was committed to living a life of stability and family because that was what she was missing and that's what she craved.
So when Adriana's coworker, 43-year-old Anthony Kennedy, began showing interest in her, she was intrigued.
Hey, Adriana.
Hey.
How was your weekend?
It was good. I just chilled. It was pretty nice.
She wanted somebody who would protect her, somebody who would provide for her, somebody who would love her.
Somebody like Anthony.
Anthony was a nice guy, quiet, reserved. He wore glasses, he seemed responsible.
He was actually her supervisor, but he was creative, he was intelligent, good with numbers, he was helpful.
He showed Adriana that he was interested in her, he pursued her.
So look, this may sound a little weird, but are you busy later?
No, I was just gonna go home. Why?
Would you like to go to dinner?
I would love that.
Anthony on paper, checked the boxes, being loving, being financially secure. They had that chemistry and things just moved on from there.
Before they knew it, Adriana and Anthony were building a life together.
The relationship moved very quickly. They moved in, they fell in love. He says, I love you, I want to make a life with you. You can see why she would have thought this is the perfect guy. Adriana's life was becoming something that she had longed for. Having a secure relationship that was going to last.
But now, just 2 weeks before the start of the holiday season, Adriana's aunt, Candy Moore, has come across an alarming social media post.
The post says that Adriana's missing.
She was concerned. She wanted answers about what had happened to Adriana.
This is Adriana's aunt.
Candy immediately reaches out to Adriana's friend, Michaela Knowles, who appears to have submitted the post to the Cleveland Remembrance page.
Why didn't you contact us sooner?
I don't know. I guess I just got nervous. I was blowing things out of proportion.
But Michaela says the last time she talked to Adriana on October 8th, something definitely seemed off.
While they were on the phone, she heard something disturbing.
She said that she sounded a little scared.
Is everything okay over there?
Gunshots were heard in the background, and the phone disconnected.
Adriana.
That was her last interaction, and no one had heard from her since.
After overcoming a difficult upbringing, 23-year-old Adriana Taylor had finally found her footing in life.
She had a good job. She had friends that cared about her.
She also found the man she wanted to share a future with, her co-worker, 43-year-old Anthony Kennedy.
What she saw in Anthony was a maturity. Anthony filled that void that a less mature man of her age couldn't give her.
But now Adriana's aunt, Candy Moore, is panicking after discovering that her niece hasn't been seen in over a month.
The last time that anyone reportedly heard from Adriana, gunshots were heard in the background.
Adriana.
This is extremely concerning.
It's a wonder why the friend didn't come right out and report that. And a lot of times, people just don't want to get that deeply involved. They don't know if it's really something, if it's really nothing.
I am so sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I was just so scared.
Within the African American community, there is a distrust of our police force. And it makes it hard to trust that they're gonna follow through, they're gonna care.
Regardless, Adriana's aunt knows it's time to involve the authorities. So on November 13th, 2022, she contacts the Cleveland Police Department to report Adriana missing.
She loved Adriana and she wanted her found.
Thank you for coming in, ma'am. Now, it's our understanding the last contact anyone had with her was October, is that correct?
That's what I was told.
We kind of learned that there seemed to be a little bit of strain with the family, and not speaking on a regular basis didn't seem super unusual. She didn't have contact with her family or even friends every day.
Adriana's aunt tells the police that her niece has been living with a boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy.
She also tells them about Adriana's disturbing final phone call.
Her friend said that they were talking on the phone when she heard gunshots.
The first thing that popped in my head was, why weren't we told about this sooner?
The timeline is very disturbing. Adriana was last seen in October, but she wasn't declared officially missing until almost mid-November. What happened in that time frame?
We need to immediately jump on this investigation.
Police start by heading to the rental Adriana and Anthony shared on the west side of town.
They knocked on the door and no one answered. It didn't look like anyone was home.
Detectives call Anthony and leave a voicemail asking him to contact them as soon as possible. And while they wait to hear back, they put out an APB on Adriana's car, a white Ford sedan.
Upon finding out Adriana had a car registered to her, I immediately took steps to find out if the vehicle's been towed, if it's in an impound lot, if it was, seen anywhere on any law enforcement databases.
Police learned that Adriana's vehicle was last spotted by traffic cameras on October 12th, over a month earlier.
Which was just a few days after her friend had spoken with Adriana.
Adriana's vehicle was last seen traveling towards Pennsylvania.
Cleveland police issue an alert for law enforcement in and around western Pennsylvania to be on the lookout for Adriana's vehicle.
Our primary concern is, where is this car?
But even though Adriana's vehicle is still in the wind, her boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy, has finally resurfaced.
He agreed to come down to the police station for an interview.
Once Anthony gets interviewed by detectives, his story is that Adriana has moved out of his house a month ago or so.
You lived with you for a couple of months, but left about a month ago. So by the beginning of October? Beginning of October into September.
Anthony says that while he and Adriana were in love a few months earlier, that changed fast after she moved in with him.
Anthony told police that Adriana had a drug habit.
Anthony says he first heard gossip about Adriana's drug use at work, but he refused to believe it.
There's all these rumors, but I'm like, don't come to me in the room, because unless I physically see it, I don't know, right? Then I found little blue pills.
He noted that the drug was fentanyl, and we know that there's an opioid crisis in America.
And then she was staying with me, and it would disappear for a few days, stay 2 days, disappear for a day, stay 3 days, disappear for a week.
Anthony claimed that she couldn't keep her job because she couldn't hold it together with all of the substance abuse.
As her supervisor, Anthony says he was forced to fire her from her role at the distribution plant. And he soon put his foot down at home, too.
I told her, I said, you can't be here no more. You gotta leave. You're causing too much problems. You're doing drugs.
He ended the relationship.
Anthony!
He's kicked her out.
And he says he hasn't talked to her since.
I think I tried to call her. She didn't answer. I just went straight to voicemail.
However, Anthony tells detectives he's heard whispers about what Adriana's been up to since their breakup.
There's rumors around where, she's thinking what to do.
Anthony told police that Adriana had gotten back with an ex-boyfriend.
But Anthony's weary to give detectives the ex-boyfriend's name.
I don't want to end up dead. No, I don't want to end up dead either. I have a name, but I don't.
The reason for his anxiety soon becomes clear.
Anthony told police that Adriana used to date somebody who was a known drug dealer.
This wasn't some small-time street corner dealer. This was somebody who was moving weight.
A big name, a big drug name.
The type of man who could make a person disappear.
This is a dangerous man we're talking about.
They're guns, they're killers, they don't play.
"48 hours after 23-year-old Adriana Taylor was reported missing in Cleveland, Ohio, her co-worker turned boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy, has just given police their first lead.
Anthony told police that Adriana had started using drugs and that maybe she'd gotten back with an ex-boyfriend who was a drug dealer.
and I believe she's messing. I don't know if he's the kingpin or one of the bigger people there.
However, Anthony is hesitant to tell the investigators everything he knows.
Just hang tight. It's okay. All right? I don't want my legs to be in danger. Okay. I don't want your legs to be in danger either.
Ultimately, Anthony pushes through his fear to give the police a name, or at least a nickname.
Bear. Bear? Like the animal or the drink? Bear? Okay.
He mentions this male, goes by the name of Bear, but alludes to the fact that he has something to do with her disappearance.
I feel like my life's in danger now. I really do. The declarations I just gave you, I feel like my life's in danger.
Anthony goes on to say he's heard rumors that Bear is expanding his drug operation.
The guy that she was with was actually trying to expand into Pennsylvania.
Could that explain why Adriana's car was last seen traveling in that direction?
There was a possibility that this was the reason that Adriana was going to that area because of her new relationship with Bear.
And if Bear is as dangerous a person as Anthony's saying, it's all the more reason police need to look into him.
It's not something that the police can overlook.
Police know drugs and violence go hand in hand. If something happened to Adriana, this could be the explanation.
But before the detectives can make much headway in locating Bear, a new lead emerges from yet another state, West Virginia.
Turns out Adriana's car was pulled over in West Virginia in October.
The traffic stop occurred on October 3rd, a week before surveillance cameras spotted the vehicle heading toward Pennsylvania, and just a few days before Adriana's alarming phone call with her friend, Michaela Knowles.
There were two people in the car. It's not known if the other passenger was Bear, but what is known is that there was possible drugs in the car.
The officer who pulled them over noted that the car had illegally tinted windows and was seen leaving a known trap house. However, no drugs were located in the vehicle at that time.
They were allowed to leave with just a citation for the tinted windows.
The information investigators are hearing seems to line up with what they've learned from Anthony Kennedy.
I told her you're causing too much problems. You're doing drugs.
But where is Adriana now? And what about the man she was last seen with?
We followed up on these leads. We reached out to hospitals, some of the shelters, normal places where you would expect someone that maybe had OD'd or was looking for some kind of help would turn up, and we found no trace of that at all.
And it was like she just vanished.
At this point of the investigation, there now seems to be more questions than answers.
But then, detectives receive a promising phone call from their colleagues in Pennsylvania.
We received information from a small suburb of Pittsburgh that they had towed her car. It was just abandoned on the street in a no parking zone.
I don't know where the car was at exactly, but good amount of dirt on the tires.
Obviously, it's been sitting a while with these leaves and stuff.
Cleveland investigators think this could be the break they've been waiting for.
We got pretty excited when we found out that her car had been found. Now again, we have another tangible lead that we can follow.
However, when Cleveland detectives arrive in Pennsylvania to examine Adriana's vehicle themselves, their hopes soon turn to new fears.
They notified us that they found quite a bit of cleaning solution throughout the vehicle.
There were several spots of blood spatter.
Alarm bells rang.
On November 16th, 4 days into the search for 23-year-old Adriana Taylor, Cleveland detectives have learned that Adriana's missing sedan has been located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh police let them know, hey, this car's been abandoned here for a little bit. I think you guys should come and look at it.
We immediately made arrangements to travel to Pittsburgh, to the area where her vehicle was recovered.
And when detectives arrive to examine the vehicle, they make a troubling discovery.
We learned the car had been cleaned.
Someone had scrubbed the vehicle from top to bottom.
But that's not all.
There were several spots of blood spatter on both the inside and outside of the vehicle. And the blood was a match for Adriana Taylor.
It's evidence that points to a disturbing possibility.
It seems like there's foul play.
That kind of gave me more of an alarm bell, as like something really might be wrong here.
With this chilling new evidence in tow, detectives start making rounds with residents on the street where Adriana's abandoned vehicle was found.
We were able to canvass the neighborhood.
They quickly turn up a promising witness.
And we're here because there was a car found in your alley. You're familiar with this.
The man describes something suspicious he witnessed on the night of October 12th.
I saw the car pull up. Okay. The guy got out of the car and he opened both back doors, took something out in a plastic bag and threw it in the dumpster that was back there. Then he checked the rest of the car around, didn't open the trunk. But he did check the rest of the car and then locked the doors and then walked that way.
Walk that way, okay. Yeah.
We learned from witnesses on scene that someone dropped off the car, cleaned it, and threw away some cleaning supplies in a dumpster.
Detectives search the dumpster for evidence, but they're out of luck.
The dumpster had already been emptied several times since the incident occurred. It was frustrating to miss out on whatever that evidence might have been.
Now more concerned than ever that Adriana's disappearance could involve foul play, investigators circle back to inform Adriana's Aunt Candy of what they've learned so far.
Adriana's loved ones were still hopeful that she would be found alive, but it was becoming harder to hold on to those hopes by the day.
It was devastating. You can't wrap your mind around it.
Hoping to verify the leads they've gotten from Anthony Kennedy, detectives inquire about Adriana's alleged drug use.
We did end up verifying that she was friends with some individuals that, did have a history of drug behavior.
But the people who know Adriana best insist she wasn't a part of that.
She didn't use drugs at all.
Maybe some pot here and there, but that was it.
Are you sure about that?
Absolutely.
We weren't really able to substantiate that she was ever into drugs.
Detectives also inquire about the man known as Bear, who Anthony penned as Adriana's drug-dealing lover.
Okay, what about a guy named Bear? Do you know him?
Yeah, I knew him. He was a friend of hers.
A boyfriend, right?
No, just a friend.
From what we were getting from everyone, Bear was like a brother to Adriana.
Okay, do you know if he was dealing drugs?
Bear? No way.
Michaela laughed at the idea of Bear being involved in drug dealing. She said that's not the kind of guy that he was at all.
Which forces the investigators to rethink everything they've been led to believe.
Anthony told us Bear deals drugs, and he was kind of casting blame upon him.
They're goons, they're killers, they don't play.
Police are not sure what's going on, how truthful this is.
It set off suspicions. Well, what's really going on here?
With Michaela's help, police are finally able to track down Bear, who they identify as 25-year-old Jabari Williams.
Were you in a romantic relationship with Adriana?
Nah, nothing like that. I mean, we hung out sometimes.
He was, in fact, Adriana's friend.
It was just an amicable relationship between two adults.
And according to Jabari, he hasn't seen Adriana in months.
When was the last time you saw her?
Probably July, maybe August.
His phone records appear to support what he's telling the police.
Other than what Anthony had told us about Bear, there was really no link between Bear and Adriana around the time of her disappearance.
Now with Bear in the clear, all roads lead back to one man, Anthony Kennedy.
It just seemed like Anthony had created a scapegoat almost, and wanted us to believe it was Bear.
Hoping to learn more about Anthony's relationship with Adriana, detectives head to the distribution plant where they both worked.
Once the police start to have these conversations with Adriana's coworkers, they start to make connections that Adriana and Anthony's relationship was not as pleasant as they thought it was.
According to coworkers, the couple's relationship had been a source of trouble from the beginning.
Anthony had actually been written up at one point because of his relationship with Adriana. As her direct supervisor, he shouldn't have had any kind of, extracurricular relationship with her.
The 20-year age gap between them also made some of their colleagues uncomfortable.
The age difference was somewhat alarming.
What it says to me about Anthony is that he was looking for someone who he would be able to maybe manipulate or even control.
When detectives asked Adriana's coworkers about the circumstances under which she was fired, they realize Anthony has misled them once again.
Adriana was let go, but she was not let go, the distribution center said, because of drugs.
She was ultimately let go because of 2 no-call, no-shows.
Her firing happened in early October, around the same time she went missing.
That would mean that Anthony Kennedy's version of what happened seemed to be a lie.
In the weeks after Adriana disappeared, employees say that Anthony's behavior grew increasingly alarming.
Anthony told one of their co-workers that he had cameras installed in their home to be able to see what Adriana was doing.
He has almost like an obsession with her. He would watch her on his camera. He talked about her constantly.
Anthony's co-workers tell detectives that when a rumor began to spread in October of 2022, his obsession evolved into jealousy.
There was some rumors going around that there was a video out there of Adriana engaging in sexual activity with another man that worked at the distribution center.
What are you laughing at?
Nothing, man. Just a video we found online, dude. Chill.
It was never proven that this was true, but this was certainly something that Anthony himself heard.
We learned from coworkers of Anthony that he made some offhand comments that he's gonna kill her because of this alleged infidelity in their relationship.
She's done!
What is his problem?
But as investigators dig deeper, they're shocked to discover Anthony was the one making moves behind closed doors.
Anthony was living a double life.
We learned that he was actually married.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of 23-year-old Adriana Taylor have just unearthed alarming new information about her 43-year-old boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy.
There was a rumor going around work that Anthony was jealous because he'd heard that Adriana had made a sex tape with someone else.
She's done!
What are you talking about?
Anthony was heard to have said that he was going to kill her.
It's really disturbing. It kind of makes you wonder, like, what is going through his head?
And as investigators dig deeper into Anthony's past, they learn that they've only scratched the surface.
Anthony was hiding a lot of secrets, but one of the biggest secrets he was hiding was that he was married. Anthony was living a double life. He was legally married to somebody else, but here he was, pursuing this younger woman at work.
When detectives contact Anthony's wife, Anastasia, she agrees to come into the station to speak with them.
Anastasia was shocked to find out that Anthony had been living with a woman in his apartment for 4 months.
I just can't believe this.
I'm so sorry, ma'am.
Anastasia tells detectives that she and Anthony were married in July of 2022, but even after exchanging vows, her husband insisted on keeping separate residences.
He was telling her that he has this lease that he can't break, and he has to stay here until it's over with.
When their leases were up, they were supposed to move in together.
Anastasia's work as a traveling nurse meant the couple spent long periods of time apart.
She had not seen Anthony in the whole month of October.
She had no idea that he was essentially living two lives. She was in complete disbelief. So he must have done a good job of keeping his two lives completely separate.
As far as the investigators are concerned, they've heard everything they need to know about Anthony Kennedy. Now, they just need to find him.
They move in for the arrest, but Anthony is on the run.
However, investigators secure a warrant to search the rental he once shared with Adriana.
Inside the apartment, it's packaged as if someone's moving, and we're immediately struck by the living room.
The carpet had been ripped up.
It was at that time that we all kind of got a sinking feeling and knew something bad had happened here.
Investigators find more concerning evidence in Anthony's backyard.
There's a giant burn mark in the rear of the driveway with what appears to be fabric within it.
Anthony had burned something large back there.
At this point, obviously, Anthony is suspect number one.
And the next day, he finally shows up at the Cleveland Police Department, ready to talk.
He wanted to kind of get this straightened out and take care of it.
Investigators start asking questions.
The carpeting being removed from the apartment. Why'd you do that? Because of bed bugs.
Anthony also attributes the burn marks in his driveway to bed bugs.
Where did you see the bed bugs at? I saw it on the couch because it bit me, and I see it all in the lining of the couch. So you cut the couch up? I cut the couch up and burned it.
Our initial reaction was deception. Everything he said to us seemed to be deceptive, short answers, kind of not making sense, talking in circles.
But as much as police suspect Anthony's involvement in Adriana's disappearance, they lack the physical evidence to prove it.
Things are still very circumstantial. There's actually not even a body. We, at this point, don't even know whether Adriana is dead or alive.
So as the Thanksgiving holiday approaches, the prime suspect in Adriana's disappearance remains a free man.
We've kind of come to a bit of a standstill on it. After the holidays, we're going to regroup, hit it hard again.
But on the night of November 24th, a stunning discovery immediately reignites the investigation.
Oh, shine that on there. That's a hand.
Oh, wow.
Two weeks after 23-year-old Adriana Taylor was reported missing, the investigation into her disappearance has come to a standstill.
The police had suspected that Adriana's boyfriend, Anthony Kennedy, was behind her disappearance. However, they didn't have enough evidence to prove it.
But at 11 p.m. on the night before Thanksgiving, as Cleveland investigators lay sleeping, police 140 miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, are responding to an alarming 911 call.
The landlord is calling police because a suspicious male appears to be digging in his backyard, and he's watching the whole thing live on his cameras.
By the time police arrive, the mystery man has fled.
He was back here for an hour. We had him on camera. Dude had cement.
That's weird.
It was immediately suspicious, and the landlord wants the spot dug into. He wants to know what he's doing back there.
Okay, let me try to get on that side and I'll try to lift it up.
Ultimately, the police kind of moved the debris, fresh, wet concrete, underneath all of this.
Something's in there, man.
I hope it's not a dead body. Shine that on there. That's a hand.
Oh, wow. Oh,
After radioing for backup, officers speak to the landlord's tenant, who had been living inside his rental property for several months.
They showed her the security video, and she instantly recognized the man on the tape.
So this guy's your relative?
He's my brother.
What's your brother's name?
Anthony Kennedy.
When news of these events reaches Cleveland, the detectives working Adriana's missing persons case are stunned.
I woke up Thanksgiving morning to about 100 missed calls and come to find out that they had found Adriana's body in Pennsylvania. And there was Ring camera footage. I was in disbelief. Like, all of our jaws were on the floor. Like, it's very rare to discover a buried body, let alone capture the whole thing on 4K HD video.
An autopsy soon confirms just how Adriana died.
Adriana was killed with a single gunshot wound to the top of her head. From the angle, it appeared that she had to have been laying or sitting at the time she was shot.
Investigators believe Adriana was killed not long after she spoke to Michaela Knowles on the phone for the last time. And when they received video footage seized from Anthony's home security cameras, their suspicions are confirmed.
On the day that we're pretty sure Adriana is killed, Anthony comes home from work, distraught, rips down the camera, and at the same time, inside the home, you see Adriana wearing the exact clothing that she was found buried in.
Although what happened next wasn't caught on camera, investigators are confident they now know how Adriana died.
When Anthony takes that camera off, it really just tells us that he intends to do something bad.
Police believe that Adriana and Anthony got into a fight.
A fight over a videotape that didn't exist.
They started arguing over the supposed videotape of Adriana sleeping with another man.
How could you do this to me? Anthony, you need to calm down. I didn't do anything to you, okay?
You're a liar!
Lying about?
Everybody at work talking about
What are you talking about? Nobody said anything. Whatever it is, it might be a lie.
He thought that Adriana was cheating on him. He felt betrayed and angry.
Investigators believe that during a break in the argument, Adriana made a phone call to her friend, Michaela.
Well, what are you up to?
But Anthony wasn't done.
So you think you can just disrespect me, right?
Girl, just hold on. Give me 1 second.
Anthony was waving a gun around and began firing.
Calm down, Anthony, please!
However, police believe the gunshots Adriana's friend heard on the phone weren't the ones that killed her.
We believe that she was shot laying down on a couch, possibly even shot taking a nap, which is the reason for the couch being burned in Anthony's backyard.
It's completely premeditated. It's unfeeling. It's horrific.
After Adriana was dead, Anthony came up with a plan to hide her body in the backyard of his sister's rental home, 140 miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
When he became a suspect in the investigation, he started to worry that he hadn't done a good enough job.
As police closed in on him, Anthony returned to his sister's rental the night before Thanksgiving to improve the burial. And thanks to the landlord's surveillance camera, it was all caught on tape.
Between the first burial and the second reburial, the landlord had actually signed up for a free trial to Ring. Unfortunately for Anthony, he picked the time to rebury the body right in the middle of that free trial. There's some kind of divine intervention.
Investigators are now confident they have the evidence they need to charge Anthony with Adriana's murder.
He's obviously dangerous, so it was our top priority to get him in custody. A lawyer reaches out to us and says that he's been retained by Anthony's family, and this lawyer negotiated his surrender.
Anthony eventually turns himself in and immediately starts talking about a plea deal.
Once he was in custody, it was a lot of conversation between lawyers, but he ended up taking a plea.
Despite Anthony's willingness to plead guilty, the court shows him little mercy.
The judge sentenced Anthony to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 23 years.
I think Anthony is where he belongs.
Fueled by rage and jealousy, Anthony Kennedy committed an act of unthinkable violence.
It seems like Anthony really wanted to have it all.
In the late 1950s, The community surrounding Royal Canadian Air Force Station Clinton in Ontario represented a version of post-war Canada that many families believed was secure, disciplined, and predictable. Built around military service, the base was more than a workplace. It shaped daily life. Families lived close together. Children attended school with classmates whose parents often knew one another through work, neighborhood gatherings, or military activities. The rhythm of the community followed familiar routines. School days ended with children walking or cycling home. Summer evenings stretched long beneath the June sun, giving young people extra hours to play outside before darkness settled over the countryside. For the families who lived there, familiarity created confidence. Roads became recognizable not because they were busy but because they were traveled every day. Fields, small patches of woodland, intersections, and quiet rural highways blended into the landscape of ordinary life. Parents understood that accidents could happen, but violent crime was not something they expected to confront. It belonged to newspaper headlines from distant cities, not to a military community where neighbors exchanged greetings and children moved freely from one house to another. Canada itself was experiencing a period of optimism. The Second World War had ended little more than a decade earlier. Economic growth had transformed many communities, and the country's expanding middle class embraced ideas of stability and progress. Television sets were appearing in more homes, family automobiles were becoming increasingly common, and communities built around military bases reflected both national pride and a belief in order. For many Canadians, these were years associated with opportunity rather than fear. Yet beneath that sense of security, rural communities remained vulnerable in ways that were not always obvious. Major highways connected isolated towns with larger cities. Travelers, seasonal workers, salesmen, tourists, and strangers passed through areas where local residents rarely questioned unfamiliar vehicles. Hitchhiking, especially among younger people, was widely accepted as a practical way to travel short distances. It did not carry the same immediate sense of danger that it would decades later. A child waiting beside a highway for a ride was not automatically viewed as being at extraordinary risk. Social attitudes simply reflected a different understanding of personal safety. That context would become critically important. On June 9, 1959, what later generations might consider alarming was, at the time, often regarded as entirely ordinary. Children walked alone. Children cycled alone. Children accepted rides from people they knew or expected to know through the community. Parents trusted that they would return home before nightfall. The routines of the day depended upon that trust. Royal Canadian Air Force Station Clinton itself functioned almost like a small town within a larger rural landscape. Military discipline shaped daily schedules, while families created neighborhoods defined by shared experiences. Many children grew up together from an early age. Friendships formed naturally through school, sports, and community events. Teachers knew their students well. Adults often recognized children by name rather than by address. This close-knit environment fostered confidence, but it also influenced the way people interpreted unexpected events. When something unusual occurred, attention naturally focused on familiar faces before considering unknown possibilities. That tendency is neither unique nor inherently unreasonable. Human beings instinctively search for explanations within the circle they already understand. As this investigation unfolded, that instinct would have profound consequences. The geography surrounding the base added another layer to the story. Rural Ontario was marked by stretches of open farmland separated by wooded areas, gravel roads, and highways connecting neighboring communities. One such wooded area, later known throughout Canada because of this case, lay near the route associated with Lynn Harper's final known movements. At first glance, the woodland appeared unremarkable. It was simply another stand of trees among many scattered throughout the countryside. Few people passing nearby would have imagined that investigators, reporters, and forensic specialists would one day examine every path, every clearing, and every piece of physical evidence recovered there. Before June 1959, it was simply part of the landscape. After June 1959, it became inseparable from one of Canada's most enduring criminal investigations. Understanding the culture of the time also requires understanding the limitations of criminal investigations during that era. Modern audiences are accustomed to DNA analysis, digital surveillance, mobile phone records, automatic license plate recognition, and sophisticated forensic laboratories capable of identifying microscopic traces. None of those investigative tools existed in 1959. Police relied heavily upon witness interviews. Investigators reconstructed movements through memory rather than electronic records. Medical opinions regarding the time of death carried enormous influence because they often represented the strongest available scientific evidence. Physical evidence certainly mattered, but forensic science remained limited compared to contemporary standards. This meant that timelines became extraordinarily important. Who saw whom? At what time? Where exactly did those encounters occur? How reliable were those memories days, weeks, or months later? Every answer helped shape the larger narrative. Every uncertainty left room for doubt. At the time, few people questioned the confidence with which experts sometimes presented their conclusions. Medical testimony often appeared definitive to juries even when the underlying science involved significant uncertainty. That confidence reflected the knowledge available during the era rather than intentional misconduct. Scientific understanding evolves. What appears reliable in one generation may later be reconsidered as methods improve. The investigation into Lynn Harper's death would eventually become one of the clearest illustrations of that reality. But those developments belonged to the future. In June 1959, investigators believed they were assembling the truth. The national media also operated very differently than it does today. Information traveled through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and evening television reports rather than instant online updates. Stories unfolded over days instead of minutes. Communities often relied upon local reporting, while major criminal cases gradually attracted wider national attention. As details surrounding Lynn Harper's disappearance emerged, public interest grew rapidly. The combination of a murdered child, a military community, and the apparent identification of a young suspect created extraordinary public attention. Few people anticipated that legal scholars would still analyze those same events nearly half a century later. The broader legal environment also deserves attention. Canadian criminal procedure during the 1950s reflected different assumptions about juvenile offenders than modern readers might expect. Although special considerations existed for younger individuals, circumstances could still lead to very young defendants facing adult criminal proceedings for the most serious offenses. Public expectations surrounding punishment were also different. Capital punishment remained part of Canadian law, and murder prosecutions carried consequences that are difficult to imagine today. These realities would become central to everything that followed. The case would not only test investigators. It would test prosecutors. It would test judges. It would ultimately test Canada's willingness to reconsider one of its own criminal convictions decades after the original verdict. Yet before any courtroom arguments began, the people involved were simply families living ordinary lives. Children attended school. Parents worked. Neighbors greeted one another. Nothing suggested that one summer evening would permanently alter the history of Canadian criminal justice. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to search for warning signs or obvious mistakes visible from the beginning. History rarely unfolds that way. People act according to the information available at the time. Decisions that later appear questionable often seemed reasonable when viewed through the limited evidence then available. That does not necessarily mean those decisions were correct. It means understanding history requires resisting the temptation to judge every moment solely through the knowledge gained afterward. The story of Lynn Harper's murder is inseparable from that challenge. The investigation would become a collision between sincere efforts to solve a horrific crime and the limitations of forensic science, witness memory, and human judgment. Those limitations would not become fully apparent for decades. By then, countless lives had already been changed. The quiet military community that once represented stability would forever be remembered for something entirely different. Instead of symbolizing safety, its name became linked to one of the most discussed criminal cases in Canadian history. Every road connected to the investigation, every reported sighting, every timeline reconstructed by police, and every piece of evidence examined in court would become part of a story extending far beyond the borders of rural Ontario. Long after the headlines faded, the questions remained. How did an ordinary June afternoon become the beginning of a national tragedy? How did a close-knit community become the setting for a crime that remains officially unsolved? And how did the search for one child's killer evolve into a case that would reshape Canada's understanding of wrongful convictions? To answer those questions, it is necessary to begin not with the investigation, but with the young girl whose absence transformed an ordinary summer day into a moment that history would never forget. The next chapter belongs to Lynn Harper herself, her family, her daily life, and the final ordinary hours before everything changed. Every homicide investigation begins with a name, but behind every name is a life that existed long before police reports, courtroom exhibits, and newspaper headlines. In this case, that life belonged to 12-year-old Lynn Harper. Over the decades, discussions surrounding her murder have often focused on the investigation, the controversial conviction of Stephen Truscott, and the legal battle that followed. Those developments became defining chapters in Canadian legal history. Yet they also had an unintended consequence. The victim herself gradually faded into the background of her own story. Before she became the center of one of Canada's most debated criminal cases, Lynn Harper was simply a young girl living with her family in the community surrounding Royal Canadian Air Force Station Clinton in Ontario. Like many children growing up in military communities during the late 1950s, her world was shaped by routines that seemed ordinary and predictable. School, family life, friendships, and familiar roads formed the boundaries of everyday experience. The available historical record offers only limited details about Lynn's personal life. Unlike many modern criminal investigations, extensive interviews, home videos, and social media archives do not exist. What remains are official records, witness testimony, newspaper accounts from the period, and the memories preserved through decades of legal proceedings. Those sources reveal only fragments of the child she was, reminding us that historical records often preserve far more information about a crime than about the person whose life was taken. What is known is that Lynn was 12 years old in June 1959. She attended school within the RCAF community and was acquainted with many of the other children who lived nearby. Military bases often fostered close relationships among families because children spent much of their time together, attending the same schools and sharing the same neighborhoods. Familiarity became part of everyday life. Many classmates had known one another for years. Among those classmates was 14-year-old Stephen Truscott. The two knew each other through school, and there was nothing unusual about children of different ages interacting within the community. On military bases during that era, older children frequently helped younger ones, and sharing bicycle rides or walking together after school would not have attracted unusual attention. Historical accounts indicate that Lynn planned to visit her grandmother on the evening of June 9, 1959. To begin that journey, she intended to reach an intersection near Highway 8 where she expected to continue her trip. The exact arrangements reflected customs that were far more common during the period than they would be today. Independent travel by children, including cycling alone or accepting rides to nearby destinations, was generally viewed as part of ordinary life. Understanding those social norms is essential because it explains why the events of that evening did not initially appear alarming to those around her. Nothing in the available evidence suggests that Lynn believed she was placing herself in danger. To the contrary, every documented action points toward what should have been an ordinary trip within a community she knew well. That ordinary expectation makes the outcome all the more devastating. When investigators later reconstructed Lynn's final known movements, they relied heavily upon witness observations collected after her disappearance. Several witnesses reported seeing Lynn riding on the bicycle driven by Stephen Truscott as they traveled toward the intersection. Those observations would later become central to the investigation because they established Stephen as the last confirmed person known to have been with Lynn. Beyond those confirmed sightings, however, the historical record becomes much less certain. Stephen consistently maintained that he left Lynn at the intersection and that she subsequently entered a light-colored automobile. His account became one of the most disputed aspects of the investigation. Investigators and prosecutors did not accept that explanation during the original case, while later reviews examined whether that possibility had been adequately considered. Because no independent evidence conclusively established what happened after the bicycle ride ended, Lynn's final documented movements remain incomplete. That uncertainty continues to define the case. For Lynn's family, however, uncertainty quickly became something much more immediate. When she failed to return home that evening, concern naturally began to grow. Families develop expectations around ordinary routines. A delayed arrival can often be explained by simple circumstances. As more time passes without explanation, those expectations gradually give way to anxiety. According to the historical record, Lynn's father reported her missing later that night after she did not come home. The search that followed reflected both urgency and hope. Missing children are often found. Sometimes they have accepted an unexpected ride. Sometimes they have visited friends without informing their parents. Sometimes simple misunderstandings explain frightening delays. At that stage, no one knew that the situation involved a homicide. That realization came only after the discovery of Lynn's body on June 11, 1959, in a wooded area known as Lawson's Bush. The post-mortem examination concluded that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Those findings transformed a missing person investigation into one of the most serious criminal investigations in Ontario at the time. The violence inflicted upon Lynn shocked investigators and the broader public alike. Crimes involving children have always carried particular emotional weight, not only because of the vulnerability of the victims but because they challenge deeply held assumptions about safety within communities. The murder immediately became more than a local tragedy. It became a matter of national attention. Yet even amid the expanding investigation, it is important to remember what cannot be recovered. The historical record documents evidence, testimony, forensic examinations, and legal proceedings. It cannot restore the experiences that Lynn never had. It cannot record the birthdays she never celebrated. It cannot describe the future that ended before it began. Every murder investigation inevitably shifts attention towards suspects, forensic evidence, and courtroom proceedings. Those elements are essential to determining responsibility, but they also risk reducing the victim to a single moment of violence. In Lynn Harper's case, decades of appeals, judicial reviews, and public debate further concentrated attention on the prosecution of Stephen Truscott. As the legal controversy expanded, the child whose death began the investigation often became secondary within public memory. The Ontario Court of Appeal's decision in 2007 fundamentally changed the legal understanding of the case by setting aside Stephen Truscott's conviction. That judgment addressed whether the evidence supported the original verdict. It did not identify another offender, nor did it resolve the murder itself. Consequently, Lynn Harper's death remains officially unsolved. That distinction is significant. A wrongful conviction does not erase the crime. It does not diminish the loss suffered by the victim's family. It simply means that the justice system concluded it could no longer support the finding that the convicted individual was responsible. The person who killed Lynn Harper has never been identified through the legal process. More than 6 decades have passed since the events of June 1959. During that time, forensic science has advanced dramatically. Investigative methods have evolved. Standards governing criminal trials have changed. The case has been studied by lawyers, historians, forensic scientists, and students of criminal justice as an example of the importance of scientific rigor and careful evaluation of evidence. But beneath all those lessons remains a child whose life ended at the age of 12. History remembers famous criminal cases for many reasons. Some expose investigative failures. Others transform legal doctrine or reshape public understanding of justice. The murder of Lynn Harper ultimately did all of those things. Yet before it became a landmark case, it was simply the loss of a young girl whose family expected her to return home on an ordinary June evening. She never did. Everything that followed the investigation, the arrest, the trial, the appeals, the public debate, and the eventual exoneration of Stephen Truscott began with that absence. It is an absence that has never truly been resolved because the central question remains unanswered. Who killed Lynn Harper? That question would drive one of the most consequential investigations in Canadian history, an investigation that initially appeared to move quickly toward a solution but would later reveal how uncertain that solution had always been. The next chapter begins with the final confirmed movements on June 9, 1959, and the chain of events that forever altered the lives of everyone connected to this case. For every missing person investigation, there is a moment when hope begins to collide with reality. At first, families and communities search with the belief that an explanation still exists. A delay can have a reason. A misunderstanding can be corrected. A person who disappears can still return. But as time passes, the nature of the search changes. The case of Lynn Harper reached that turning point on June 11, 1959. 2 days had passed since the 12-year-old girl was last seen. During those hours, investigators, volunteers, and members of the surrounding community had been trying to understand what had happened after she left the familiar roads near the Royal Canadian Air Force Station Clinton area. At the beginning, the investigation centered on finding Lynn alive. Police efforts focused on reconstructing her final known movements, speaking with people who had seen her, and determining where she might have gone after leaving school and beginning her journey. But the discovery on June 11 transformed every unanswered question into something far more serious. Lynn Harper's body was found in an area known as Lawson's Bush, a wooded location not far from the route connected to her final known movements. The discovery ended the uncertainty of a missing child case, but it replaced that uncertainty with a far more disturbing reality. Lynn was dead. The medical examination that followed determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The investigation was no longer about locating a missing child. It became a homicide investigation. For the investigators involved, the scene represented the beginning of an enormous challenge. They had a victim. They had a location. They had a limited window of time in which events had occurred. But they did not yet have a clear picture of who was responsible. The first task in any homicide investigation is to separate what is known from what is assumed. What was known was that Lynn had been seen earlier in the day. What was known was that she had been traveling toward an intersection near Highway 8. What was known was that she did not return home. What was known was where her body was eventually found. Everything beyond those points required interpretation. And interpretation would become one of the defining issues of this case. The wooded area where Lynn was discovered immediately became central to the investigation. Police examined the location for physical evidence and attempted to determine what the surroundings could reveal. In 1959, forensic technology was far more limited than it is today. There were no DNA databases capable of matching biological material to an unknown suspect. There were no modern digital records tracking movements. Investigators had to rely on the methods available at the time. Physical evidence, witness statements, and medical findings would carry enormous importance. One of the most significant questions was timing. When exactly had Lynn died? That question was not simply a medical detail. It was potentially the foundation of the entire investigation. Establishing a timeline meant determining who could have been present, who had the opportunity, and whether certain accounts were possible. At the original investigation, medical testimony regarding the estimated time of death played a major role. Experts examined factors including the contents of Lynn's stomach and other available observations. Their conclusion placed the time of death within a period that aligned with the prosecution's later theory of the case. However, decades later, those conclusions would be heavily questioned. Advances in forensic science led experts to re-examine the methods used in 1959. Later analysis suggested that the original estimate may not have been reliable and that Lynn's death could have occurred later than first believed. That possibility would become one of the most important issues in the eventual reconsideration of Stephen Truscott's conviction. But in June 1959, investigators did not have the benefit of future scientific knowledge. They worked with the evidence and expertise available to them. As the investigation continued, attention quickly focused on the people who had last been seen with Lynn. This was a common pattern in criminal investigations then and remains so today. When someone disappears, investigators naturally examine the last known interactions, the last known locations, and the last known people connected to the victim. In Lynn's case, Stephen Truscott became central to the investigation because witnesses had seen him with her shortly before she disappeared. Stephen was 14 years old. He was a student who knew Lynn through school. He was not a stranger who had appeared from outside the community. That fact shaped the investigation in profound ways. The police theory developed around the idea that Stephen had been the last person with an opportunity to harm Lynn. Prosecutors would later argue that instead of leaving her at the intended intersection, he had taken her elsewhere. Stephen denied this. He maintained that he had left Lynn at the intersection and that he saw her afterward enter a light-colored vehicle. That statement became one of the major disputed points of the case. The question was not only what Stephen said. The question was whether investigators had fully considered other possibilities. As the investigation intensified, the community that had once been defined by familiarity and trust became surrounded by fear and suspicion. A violent crime against a child had occurred in a place where many people believed such an event was almost unimaginable. Public pressure grew. The demand for answers became stronger. And as often happens in high-profile cases, the need to find a solution began competing with the uncertainty that remained in the evidence. The discovery of Lynn Harper's body created a sense of urgency that would influence everything that followed. Investigators were under pressure to identify the person responsible. The public wanted justice. A family wanted answers. But justice requires more than a conclusion. It requires the correct conclusion. The events following Lynn's discovery would demonstrate how difficult that distinction could be. The investigation would move rapidly toward a suspect. Evidence would be interpreted through competing theories. A young teenager would become the center of one of Canada's most controversial criminal proceedings. Yet even after decades of legal review, one question would remain unanswered. What truly happened between the moment Lynn Harper left the familiar roads near her community and the moment she was found in Lawson's Bush? The location where she was discovered provided investigators with the beginning of their search for the truth. But it did not provide the final answer. The forest held evidence. The investigation created a timeline. The courtroom would later examine the accusations. But the person responsible for Lynn Harper's death would never be identified. And that uncertainty would follow the case for generations. Once Lynn Harper's body was discovered, the investigation entered a new and far more difficult stage. A missing child case had become a murder investigation, and every detail of the previous days was suddenly viewed through a different lens. Conversations that had seemed ordinary became evidence. Movements that had seemed routine became part of a timeline. People who had known Lynn were asked to remember exactly where they had been, what they had seen, and what they had heard. The central question was simple, but answering it would prove extraordinarily complicated. Who had killed Lynn Harper? In any homicide investigation, the earliest hours are often considered critical. Investigators attempt to preserve evidence, establish a sequence of events, and identify anyone who may have had contact with the victim. In 1959, however, the tools available to police were limited compared with modern standards. There were no DNA profiles that could connect an unknown person to biological evidence. There were no phone records or digital trails. Much of the investigation depended on witness statements, physical observations, and expert interpretation. That meant human memory became one of the most important sources of information. Witnesses were asked to reconstruct the final known hours of Lynn's life. They described seeing her earlier that day. They described her movements. They described the bicycle ride that would become the foundation of the case. Among those witnesses was Stephen Truscott. Stephen was 14 years old, a student who lived in the same community and attended the same school as Lynn. According to the evidence presented at the time, he had been seen with Lynn on the bicycle shortly before she disappeared. This single fact would place him at the center of the investigation. The police focus on Stephen was not based on him being an unknown outsider. In fact, the opposite was true. He was someone familiar within the community. He was a teenager who had interacted with Lynn before. He was someone whose movements could be traced through witnesses. From the perspective of investigators in 1959, the last confirmed person seen with a victim naturally became a person of interest. However, being the last known person with someone does not automatically prove responsibility. That distinction would become the heart of the controversy surrounding the case. Stephen consistently stated that he had given Lynn a ride toward the intersection near Highway 8, where she intended to continue her journey. He said that after leaving her there, he saw her approach a light-colored vehicle. This account was crucial because it introduced another possible explanation for what happened after the bicycle ride ended. If Stephen's account was accurate, then Lynn may have encountered another person after they separated. But investigators and prosecutors did not accept that version of events. The investigation developed around a different theory. They believed that Stephen had not left Lynn at the intersection as he claimed. Instead, they argued that he had taken her toward Lawson's Bush, where she was later found. The difference between those two versions of events was only a matter of distance and time. But it represented the entire case. One path led away from Stephen. The other path placed him directly at the center of the crime. A major part of the prosecution's argument depended on the estimated time of Lynn's death. At the original investigation, medical experts concluded that Lynn had likely died during the early evening hours of June 9. This timeline appeared to match the theory that Stephen had harmed her shortly after the bicycle ride. At the time, the methods used to estimate time of death were considered valid. Experts relied on available medical knowledge and forensic practices. Their conclusions carried significant authority in court because jurors often depended on scientific testimony to understand evidence beyond everyday experience. But the passage of time would change how those conclusions were viewed. Years later, advances in forensic science would lead experts to question the reliability of the original time of death estimate. One important area of reconsideration involved forensic entomology, the study of insects and their development in relation to decomposition. Evidence collected during the original investigation but not fully used at trial became part of later reviews. These later evaluations suggested that Lynn may have died significantly later than the prosecution had argued. If that was true, the timeline supporting the conviction became much less certain. But in 1959, that possibility was not part of the courtroom discussion. The investigation continued forward. As police built their case, the atmosphere surrounding the community became increasingly intense. The murder of a child had already created fear and anger. People wanted the person responsible to be found. Every new piece of information attracted attention. In such circumstances, investigators face enormous pressure. The public expects answers. Families need closure. Authorities must demonstrate that they are taking action. But pressure can also create risks. When investigators develop a strong theory early in a case, later evidence may sometimes be viewed through that existing framework. Alternative explanations can receive less attention. Contradictory information can become harder to integrate. This phenomenon, often called tunnel vision, would later become one of the major themes discussed in relation to the Truscott case. The question was not whether investigators cared about solving Lynn's murder. They clearly did. The question was whether the investigation gave sufficient weight to all possibilities. One of the most significant debates involved the possibility that someone else may have encountered Lynn after Stephen left her. Stephen's claim about the light-colored vehicle was never accepted as proof of another suspect. There was no confirmed identification of another person connected to the vehicle. However, later reviews questioned whether the possibility had been dismissed too quickly. A murder investigation requires not only finding evidence that supports a theory. It requires testing whether competing explanations can be ruled out. The case against Stephen continued to grow, and eventually he was charged with murder. The decision was extraordinary because Stephen was only 14 years old. The idea of a child being accused of such a serious crime shocked many people, but the legal system of the era allowed young defendants to face adult criminal proceedings under certain circumstances. The accusation changed Stephen's life immediately. A teenager who had lived within a familiar community suddenly became the focus of national attention. His name appeared in newspapers across Canada. The investigation was no longer only a local tragedy. It had become a national criminal case. As the trial approached, the competing narratives became clearer. The prosecution presented a story in which Stephen was the person responsible for Lynn's death. The defense argued that the evidence did not prove that conclusion and that Stephen's account raised reasonable doubt. At the center of everything was a timeline. Where was Lynn during the critical period? When did she die? Who had the opportunity to harm her? And how certain could anyone truly be? The investigation had produced a suspect. It had produced a theory. It had produced a case that appeared ready for court. But the unanswered questions remained beneath the surface. The discovery of Lynn's body had started the search for justice. Now the investigation had to determine whether it had found the truth. The next stage would move from the investigation room to the courtroom, where a 14-year-old boy would face a charge carrying the most severe possible punishment under Canadian law. For many years, the case of Lynn Harper appeared to have reached its final chapter long before anyone questioned the conclusion. A young girl had been murdered. A suspect had been identified. A trial had taken place. A verdict had been delivered. In the eyes of the law at the time, the mystery had been solved. But history would prove that a verdict is not always the same thing as the truth. The real turning point in the Lynn Harper case did not come in the months immediately after the investigation. It came decades later, when new generations of legal experts, scientists, and investigators began to examine the evidence with the advantage of time, new knowledge, and improved forensic understanding. The case that had once seemed closed slowly began to reopen. The first major challenge came from a simple but fundamental question. What if the timeline was wrong? A timeline is the invisible structure holding an investigation together. It determines who could have been present, who had an opportunity, and which explanations are possible. If the timeline changes, the entire case can change with it. In 1959, the prosecution's theory depended heavily on the belief that Lynn Harper died shortly after she was last seen with Stephen Truscott. That conclusion supported the argument that Stephen had the opportunity to commit the crime. But decades later, experts began examining whether the original estimate of Lynn's time of death could truly be relied upon. The science available in the late 1950s was different from the science available decades later. Medical understanding had developed significantly. Forensic methods had improved. Techniques that once seemed dependable were re-evaluated under newer standards. One of the most important areas of reconsideration involved forensic entomology. Forensic entomology examines insects associated with human remains and can sometimes help estimate the passage of time after death. Insects follow predictable patterns of development, and under certain circumstances, their presence can provide valuable information about when a person died. Evidence related to insects had been collected during the original investigation. However, it was not used in the original trial in the way it would later be examined. When specialists reviewed the material years later, their conclusions raised serious questions about the original timeline. The later analysis suggested that Lynn's death may have occurred later than the prosecution originally claimed. That possibility was critical. If Lynn died hours later than believed, then the timeline connecting Stephen to the crime became much weaker. The assumption that had placed him in the window of opportunity was no longer as certain. A case built around a specific sequence of events began to show cracks. But the reconsideration did not stop there. Other aspects of the original investigation were also reviewed. Witness testimony, once treated as firm evidence, was examined with a different understanding of human memory. Modern psychology has shown that memories are not perfect recordings of events. They can change over time. People may unintentionally become more confident in details that were uncertain or may interpret past events through later information. This does not mean witnesses were dishonest. It means that memory itself has limitations. The Truscott case became an example frequently discussed in relation to those limitations. The passage of nearly 5 decades created an unusual situation. The same evidence that had once been presented as proof was now being examined for uncertainty. The question changed. It was no longer only, was Stephen Truscott guilty? It became, was the evidence strong enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? That distinction is fundamental in criminal justice. A court does not require certainty that a person is innocent. It requires the prosecution to prove guilt to the required legal standard. As the years passed, questions surrounding the case continued to grow. Researchers, journalists, legal scholars, and members of the public revisited the events of 1959. The story of a 14-year-old boy sentenced for murder became increasingly difficult to separate from concerns about the reliability of the original investigation. The case also raised broader questions about the treatment of young defendants. In 1959, Stephen Truscott was tried as an adult despite being only 14 years old. The seriousness of the accusation meant the legal system treated him differently from what many people today would expect. The sentence he received became one of the most shocking aspects of the case. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. The image of a 14-year-old facing execution created widespread controversy. Public opinion began to shift. Many Canadians questioned whether such a severe punishment could ever be appropriate for someone so young. Others questioned whether the evidence itself had been strong enough to support the conviction. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. But the controversy did not disappear. For Stephen Truscott, the consequences of the conviction continued for decades. The label attached to his name followed him long after the original trial ended. For Lynn Harper's family, the situation was also devastatingly complicated. They had lost a child in a brutal crime. They had spent decades living with the consequences of a case that never produced a confirmed identification of the true killer. The reopening of the case did not erase that pain. A wrongful conviction does not solve an unsolved murder. It creates another tragedy alongside the original one. As reviews continued, the Canadian legal system was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how the case had been handled. Could the investigation have moved too quickly toward one theory? Were alternative possibilities examined thoroughly enough? Did the original trial place too much confidence in evidence that later proved uncertain? These were not questions about whether a terrible crime occurred. Lynn Harper was murdered. That fact was never in dispute. The uncertainty concerned who was responsible. The later examination of the case did not produce a new suspect. It did not reveal a confirmed alternative explanation. Instead, it created something equally important in the legal system: doubt. And that doubt eventually reached the highest levels of review. The Canadian government ordered a review of the case, and legal proceedings followed. The purpose was not to decide whether a different person was guilty. The purpose was to determine whether the original conviction could still stand based on the evidence available. The conclusion was historic. In 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Stephen Truscott's conviction. The court did not declare that it knew who killed Lynn Harper. It did not solve the murder. It recognized that the evidence supporting the conviction was no longer sufficient. The decision marked the end of a legal journey that had lasted nearly half a century. A conviction once considered one of Canada's most certain criminal judgments had been undone. The case became a symbol of the danger of relying too heavily on uncertain evidence, especially when the consequences are irreversible. But even after that legal victory, the central mystery remained. Someone killed Lynn Harper. Someone committed a crime that shocked a nation. And that person was never identified. The breakthrough in this case was not the discovery of a hidden killer. It was the discovery that the original certainty had never been as strong as it appeared. The investigation had found a suspect. The courtroom had reached a verdict. But decades later, the search for truth revealed something far more complicated. Sometimes the most important discovery in a criminal case is not finding the answer. Sometimes it is realizing that the answer you were given was never proven. In the history of criminal cases, few moments carry as much weight as the moment a verdict is delivered. A courtroom exists to transform uncertainty into a decision. Evidence is presented, arguments are made, and a judge or jury is asked to determine what can be proven. For the murder of Lynn Harper, that moment came in 1959. But unlike many criminal cases where a conviction closes the door on the past, the verdict in the Lynn Harper case would remain open to questions for decades. The trial of Stephen Truscott became one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in Canadian history. The reason was not only the nature of the crime, but also the age of the accused. Stephen was 14 years old when he entered the courtroom facing a charge that carried the most severe possible punishment under Canadian law. The image of a teenager standing accused of murdering a younger child shocked many people. The case placed the justice system under intense attention. The prosecution argued that the evidence pointed toward Stephen as the person responsible for Lynn's death. Their theory depended heavily on the timeline established during the investigation. They argued that Stephen had the opportunity to commit the crime after taking Lynn away from the expected route toward the intersection. The evidence presented to the court included witness observations, medical testimony, and the circumstances surrounding Lynn's final known movements. At the center of the prosecution's case was the belief that the events after the bicycle ride had been different from Stephen's account. Stephen maintained that he had left Lynn near the intersection and that she later approached a light-colored vehicle. The two versions of events could not both be true. The courtroom became the place where those competing explanations were examined. One of the most significant elements was the medical evidence regarding the estimated time of Lynn's death. In 1959, experts presented their conclusions based on the forensic knowledge available at the time. The estimate placed Lynn's death within a period that supported the prosecution's timeline. For the jury, scientific testimony carried great influence. To many people, forensic evidence appeared to provide certainty. But science is not frozen in time. Methods change. Understanding develops. What is considered reliable in one era may later be questioned as knowledge advances. That would become one of the central issues in the later reassessment of the case. During the trial, however, the jury was asked to make a decision based on the information available to them at that moment. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of events and argued that the evidence did not prove Stephen's guilt. They questioned whether the timeline was reliable and whether the circumstances truly established what had happened after Stephen and Lynn separated. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's case. Stephen Truscott was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence was extraordinary. He was sentenced to death by hanging. A 14-year-old boy had become one of the youngest people in Canadian history to receive such a sentence. The reaction to the conviction was immediate and intense. The case moved beyond the courtroom and became a national debate. Some believed the verdict represented justice for Lynn Harper. They saw the conviction as accountability for a terrible crime committed against a child. Others questioned whether a teenager could have received a fair assessment and whether the evidence was truly strong enough to justify the punishment imposed. The controversy became impossible to ignore. Public attention grew. Legal experts debated the case. Citizens wrote letters and expressed concern about the possibility of executing someone so young. The death sentence was eventually reduced to life imprisonment. But changing the sentence did not end the questions. For Stephen Truscott, the conviction remained attached to his identity. For Lynn Harper's family, the situation remained painful and unresolved. They had lost a daughter, but the later controversy surrounding the case created another layer of uncertainty. The legal outcome that was supposed to provide answers would eventually become the subject of its own examination. Over the following decades, Stephen maintained his innocence. The case continued to attract attention from journalists, legal researchers, and members of the public who questioned whether the original investigation and trial had reached the correct conclusion. As time passed, the understanding of forensic evidence changed. The original time of death analysis became increasingly questioned. New evaluations of evidence suggested that the timeline presented at trial might not have been reliable. This was not simply a disagreement over minor details. The timeline was one of the foundations of the prosecution's argument. If that foundation weakened, the entire structure of the conviction became less certain. The case eventually returned to the legal system. A review of the evidence examined whether the conviction could still be supported. The purpose of the review was not to decide who should be blamed instead. The justice system was not being asked to identify a new suspect. It was being asked a more fundamental question. Could the original verdict still stand? In criminal law, the standard required for conviction is extremely high. A person must be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A conviction cannot survive simply because a theory seems possible. It must be supported by evidence strong enough to exclude reasonable alternatives. The reconsideration of the Truscott case revealed that the evidence did not meet that standard. The original certainty had weakened. The timeline was no longer considered reliable enough. Important aspects of the evidence had changed in interpretation. And after nearly 50 years, the legal system reached a very different conclusion. In 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Stephen Truscott's conviction. The decision did not identify another killer. It did not answer every question surrounding Lynn Harper's death. It did something more limited but equally important. It recognized that the original conviction could not continue to stand. The ruling represented a major moment in Canadian legal history. A conviction that had shaped public understanding of justice for almost half a century had been reversed. The case became a powerful example of the dangers of wrongful convictions and the importance of continually examining evidence as science and legal standards evolve. After the decision, the Canadian government provided compensation to Stephen Truscott for the decades he spent carrying the consequences of a conviction that had been overturned. But no amount of compensation could restore the years lost. No legal decision could return Lynn Harper to her family. And no court ruling could provide the answer that remained missing. Who killed Lynn Harper? The justice system had answered one question. It had determined that Stephen Truscott's conviction could not stand. But the larger mystery remained unresolved. A child had been murdered. A teenager had spent decades connected to a crime he was no longer legally considered responsible for. And somewhere between those two tragedies was the person who committed the act itself. The case of Lynn Harper shows that justice is not always a straight path from crime to conviction. Sometimes the search for truth requires admitting that a previous conclusion was wrong. Sometimes justice means not holding on to an answer simply because it was reached in the past. The courtroom that once delivered a verdict eventually became the place where that verdict was questioned. And the final chapter of the story would not be about a conviction. It would be about what remained after the conviction disappeared. A family still waiting for answers. A murder still unsolved. And a question that has remained unanswered for more than 60 years. More than 6 decades after the events of June 1959, the case of Lynn Harper remains one of the most haunting chapters in Canadian criminal history. It is remembered not because it reached a satisfying conclusion, but because it never truly did. A child was killed. A teenager was convicted. A conviction was later overturned. And the identity of the person responsible has never been established. Those facts exist together, creating a story that is not only about a murder investigation, but also about the limits of human certainty. When people look back at a case decades later, it is easy to imagine that the answers should have been obvious. Time creates distance, and distance can create the illusion that mistakes should have been visible from the beginning. But the reality of investigations is far more complicated. The police officers who worked on the case in 1959 were trying to solve a horrifying crime with the tools, knowledge, and forensic methods available to them at that time. They were faced with the murder of a child, intense public pressure, and the responsibility of finding the person who had caused unimaginable harm. The justice system followed the evidence as it understood it. The jury reached a decision based on what was presented. The conviction reflected the standards and beliefs of that era. Yet decades later, the same case would demonstrate how knowledge changes. Science evolves. Methods improve. Old conclusions are sometimes reconsidered. The overturning of Stephen Truscott's conviction became a reminder that a legal verdict, even one reached through a formal process, is not beyond examination. The purpose of reviewing old cases is not to erase the past. It is to determine whether the conclusions of the past still withstand careful examination. In this case, they did not. The decision to overturn the conviction did not solve Lynn Harper's murder. It did not reveal a hidden offender. It did not provide the final moment of closure that many unsolved cases eventually receive. Instead, it left behind a more difficult reality. The person who killed Lynn Harper was never identified. For Lynn's family, this meant that the passage of time did not bring the resolution that families of victims often hope for. The legal process had produced a dramatic change, but it could not answer the question that had mattered from the beginning. Who was responsible? That question remains at the center of the case. The story of Lynn Harper is also a reminder that victims can sometimes disappear from public memory as a case becomes dominated by legal controversy. After 1959, much of the attention surrounding the case focused on Stephen Truscott, the trial, the conviction, and the later appeals. Those events were historically significant. But the beginning of the story was not a courtroom. It was a 12-year-old girl whose life ended. Every discussion about wrongful convictions and legal failures must still return to the person whose death created the investigation in the first place. Lynn Harper was not a symbol. She was not merely evidence in a trial. She was a child. The lasting tragedy is that the case produced neither complete accountability nor complete understanding. The justice system ultimately acknowledged that Stephen Truscott should not have been convicted, but it could not identify who should have been held responsible. This creates a rare and painful situation. The legal system corrected one injustice, but the original crime remained unresolved. Over the years, the case has continued to be studied by those interested in criminal justice, forensic science, and wrongful convictions. It is often discussed alongside other cases where investigations were shaped by limited evidence, unreliable assumptions, or evolving scientific standards. One of the most important lessons from the case is the danger of treating uncertainty as certainty. A timeline may appear precise but still contain flaws. A witness may be sincere but mistaken. A scientific conclusion may seem definitive but later require reconsideration. These are not failures unique to one investigation. They are challenges faced by justice systems everywhere. The purpose of evidence is not to create a convincing story. It is to discover what actually happened. That difference is at the heart of the Lynn Harper case. The investigation created a narrative. The trial examined that narrative. The conviction accepted it. But later review revealed that the narrative was not strong enough to survive deeper examination. The case also changed public conversations about young people in the criminal justice system. The fact that Stephen Truscott was only 14 years old when he was convicted became one of the most discussed aspects of the story. His age forced society to confront difficult questions. How should the justice system respond when a child is accused of an extremely serious crime? How much certainty should be required before imposing the harshest possible punishment? What happens when the system later discovers that its confidence was misplaced? Those questions remain relevant far beyond this single case. Yet despite all the legal discussions, scientific debates, and historical analysis, there is still a quiet absence at the center of the story. The absence of an answer. The person who killed Lynn Harper has never been named. There has been no final confession. No definitive forensic match. No courtroom moment revealing the truth. The case remains an open wound in Canadian criminal history. For some cases, time brings resolution. For others, time only adds layers. The Lynn Harper case gained layers of legal debate, scientific reassessment, and public discussion, but the fundamental mystery remained untouched. What happened after Lynn disappeared? Who did she encounter? What evidence was missed? Which possibilities were overlooked? Those questions have followed the case for generations. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that the story does not end with a dramatic revelation. It ends with uncertainty. A young girl's life was taken. A 14-year-old boy lost decades to a conviction that was later overturned. A community changed forever. And a nation was forced to confront the possibility that justice can fail even when everyone involved believes they are searching for the truth. The case of Lynn Harper is therefore not only a story about a murder. It is a story about memory. About evidence. About the responsibility of courts and investigators. And about the importance of recognizing that being certain does not always mean being correct. The search for justice is not complete simply because a verdict has been reached. Justice requires truth. And in the case of Lynn Harper, that truth remains unfinished. More than 60 years later, her name continues to represent both a tragedy and a warning. A reminder that behind every case file is a human life. A reminder that every unanswered question belongs to someone. And a reminder that sometimes the hardest mysteries are not the ones where no one knows what happened. They are the ones where everyone once believed they did. Some stories end with an answer. A suspect is identified. A trial reaches its conclusion. A family finally receives the explanation they have been waiting for. But the story of Lynn Harper does not belong to that category. More than 60 years after the events of June 1959, the case remains suspended between what is known and what is unknown. The historical record contains investigations, testimony, court decisions, and decades of legal examination. Yet the central question remains unanswered. Who killed Lynn Harper? The passage of time has changed almost everything connected to the case. The community where Lynn lived has changed. The methods used by investigators have changed. The understanding of forensic science has changed. The standards used to evaluate evidence have changed. But one thing has remained the same. A 12-year-old girl lost her life, and the person responsible has never been identified. That unresolved ending is what makes the case so difficult to forget. Many criminal cases become famous because they reveal the identity of the person responsible. Others become important because they expose weaknesses in the justice system. The Lynn Harper case became both a murder mystery and a lesson about how justice can sometimes move in the wrong direction. The original investigation believed it had found the answer. The courtroom accepted that conclusion. But decades later, the legal system itself acknowledged that the conviction could not stand. The overturning of Stephen Truscott's conviction was not a declaration that the crime did not happen. It was not a suggestion that Lynn Harper's death was somehow less important. It was a recognition that a person cannot remain legally responsible for a crime when the evidence no longer proves that responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction is essential. A wrongful conviction and an unsolved murder are two different tragedies. One concerns the person who was wrongly accused. The other concerns the victim whose killer remains unknown. In this case, both tragedies existed at the same time. The story of Stephen Truscott became one of Canada's most discussed examples of wrongful conviction. His name became connected with debates about evidence, criminal procedure, and the possibility of judicial error. But behind that debate was always another name. Lynn Harper. The child whose death started everything. When a case remains unresolved for decades, it can become tempting to focus only on theories. People search for hidden clues, overlooked possibilities, and explanations that might finally complete the story. But responsible investigation requires more than speculation. It requires evidence. And in the absence of confirmed evidence, questions must remain questions. The case has produced many discussions about what might have happened after Lynn and Stephen were last seen together. It has raised concerns about whether every possibility was properly explored. It has shown how difficult it can be to reconstruct events when the available information is incomplete. But uncertainty itself is also part of the truth. The honest conclusion is not always the most satisfying one. Sometimes the truth is that the evidence is insufficient. Sometimes the truth is that a mystery remains. The lessons from the Lynn Harper case continue to influence conversations about criminal justice. Investigators must remain open to alternative explanations. Scientific evidence must be evaluated carefully. Confidence must not replace proof. And every person involved in a criminal case must be remembered as a human being rather than only as a name in a file. For future generations, the case stands as a reminder that justice is not only about finding someone to blame. It is about finding what actually happened. Those two goals may appear identical, but history has shown they are not always the same. The search for truth can be long. It can be frustrating. And sometimes it may never reach the ending people hope for. Yet continuing to ask questions remains important. Not because questions are a substitute for answers, but because every unanswered question represents something that still matters. Lynn Harper's story continues to matter because her life mattered. Before there was an investigation, before there was a courtroom, before there were arguments about evidence and legal standards, there was a young girl who should have had a future. That future was taken away. The years that followed changed Canadian criminal history, but they could never change the simplest fact at the center of the case. A child was lost. And the search for the truth continues. Some cases disappear from public memory as years pass. New stories replace old ones. New investigations capture attention. Names once printed on the front pages slowly become unfamiliar to younger generations. But some cases refuse to disappear. The murder of Lynn Harper remains one of those cases. Not because the investigation produced a final answer, but because it left behind questions that continue to challenge the way people think about justice, evidence, and certainty. When the events of June 1959 are examined today, they are no longer viewed only as a criminal investigation. They have become a study of how a justice system works under pressure, how evidence is interpreted, and how difficult it can be to separate what is known from what is assumed. The tragedy began with a missing child. It later became a courtroom battle. Then it became a decades-long examination of whether the original conclusion could be trusted. The case changed because the understanding of evidence changed. In 1959, investigators and prosecutors worked within the boundaries of their time. They did not have access to the technology available today. They did not have modern DNA analysis. They did not have the ability to revisit every movement through digital records. They relied on witness memories, physical evidence, and forensic opinions available at that moment. That was the reality of criminal investigation in that era. But the passage of time brought new questions. One of the most important lessons from the case is that evidence is not simply a collection of facts. Evidence must be interpreted. And interpretation depends on knowledge, methods, and assumptions. A timeline can appear clear until new information changes the way it is understood. A scientific conclusion can seem certain until later research reveals its limitations. A witness can speak honestly while still remembering something incorrectly. These possibilities do not mean that people acted with bad intentions. They show the difficulty of reconstructing the past. A crime scene is a frozen moment in time, but the investigation happens later, after memories have faded and pieces of information must be assembled. That challenge becomes even greater when the victim cannot tell their own story. Lynn Harper could never explain what happened. She could not identify who she encountered. She could not describe the final moments of her life. The investigation had to rely entirely on the evidence left behind. And when evidence is incomplete, the possibility of error increases. The case also demonstrated how public emotion can influence the atmosphere surrounding a criminal investigation. A violent crime involving a child creates fear unlike almost any other type of crime. Communities naturally want protection. Families want answers. The public wants reassurance that the person responsible will be found. That pressure is understandable. But justice requires patience. A rushed answer can sometimes create a different kind of tragedy. The story of Stephen Truscott became inseparable from this issue. A 14-year-old boy became the face of a murder case that captured national attention. For decades, his conviction represented one of the most controversial moments in Canadian legal history. When that conviction was overturned, the case became a symbol of another reality. The justice system, like any human system, can make mistakes. Recognizing those mistakes does not weaken justice. In many ways, it strengthens it. A system that refuses to question itself cannot improve. The review of the case forced Canada to examine difficult issues. How should courts evaluate uncertain evidence? How much confidence should be placed in expert testimony? What protections are necessary when a young person is accused of a serious crime? Those discussions extended beyond one courtroom. They became part of a larger conversation about wrongful convictions. But even as the case became an important legal example, it remained a personal tragedy. For the Harper family, the story was never an academic debate. It was the loss of a daughter. For the Truscott family, it was the experience of living with a conviction that was later overturned. The consequences of the case were carried by real people for decades. That human reality is sometimes lost when criminal cases become historical events. Names become headlines. Lives become evidence. Pain becomes part of a timeline. But behind every legal document is a person. Behind every courtroom argument is a family. And behind every unsolved murder is someone whose absence never stops being felt. The unanswered nature of Lynn Harper's case is perhaps the most haunting part of all. The legal system eventually determined what could not be proven. But it never discovered what actually happened. The person responsible has never been publicly identified through the justice system. The final chapter that many hoped for never arrived. There was no final confession. No definitive explanation. No moment where the mystery disappeared. Instead, the case remains a reminder that some questions survive longer than the people who first asked them. More than 60 years later, the name Lynn Harper continues to represent both a tragedy and a warning. A warning about the danger of certainty without proof. A warning about the responsibility involved in accusing someone of the most serious crimes. A warning that every investigation must continue searching for truth, even when an answer seems to have been found. Because the goal of justice is not simply to end uncertainty. It is to end uncertainty with the truth. And in the case of Lynn Harper, that search remains unfinished. Some mysteries remain alive because they are constantly changing. New evidence appears. New witnesses come forward. New technology reveals details that were invisible before. But other mysteries remain alive for a different reason. They remain because, despite decades of searching, the most important question has never been answered. The case of Lynn Harper belongs to that second category. More than 60 years have passed since the events of June 1959, yet the story continues to be examined by historians, legal experts, and those who study wrongful convictions. The reason is not only the tragedy of the crime itself, but the complicated path that followed. The case began as a search for a missing child. It became a murder investigation. It became a landmark criminal trial. It became one of Canada's most debated examples of a wrongful conviction. And after all of that, it returned to the same unanswered question. Who killed Lynn Harper? The passage of time has not erased the importance of that question. If anything, time has made the uncertainty more significant. When a crime first occurs, investigators work with urgency. Every hour matters. Every decision may affect the possibility of finding the person responsible. Evidence must be collected. Witnesses must be interviewed. A sequence of events must be reconstructed. But as years become decades, the nature of the search changes. The immediate urgency disappears. What remains is analysis. The case file becomes a historical record. Old conclusions are examined. Old assumptions are questioned. And sometimes the distance of time allows people to see things differently. The Lynn Harper case became an example of why the examination of evidence must never stop at the first conclusion. A successful investigation is not simply one that produces an arrest. A successful investigation is one that finds the truth. Those two things are not always the same. The original investigation led to Stephen Truscott being identified, charged, and convicted. For many years, that conviction was accepted as the official explanation of what happened. But the later review of the case showed that important aspects of the evidence were not as certain as they had once appeared. The scientific understanding of evidence had changed. The evaluation of witness testimony had changed. The expectations placed on criminal investigations had changed. The result was a recognition that the conviction could not stand. This created one of the most difficult situations possible in criminal justice. The system had corrected a mistake, but the original crime remained unsolved. There was no replacement answer. No confirmed alternative suspect. No final explanation. Only the recognition that the previous conclusion was not supported strongly enough. For many people, that reality is difficult to accept. Human beings naturally seek resolution. A story without an ending feels incomplete. A crime without an identified offender feels unresolved. A family without answers is left carrying a burden that time cannot remove. But uncertainty is sometimes the most honest conclusion available. The case also demonstrates how important it is to remember the difference between suspicion and proof. Suspicion can guide an investigation. It can determine where attention should be focused. But suspicion alone cannot establish guilt. A criminal conviction requires evidence strong enough to remove reasonable doubt. That principle exists because the consequences of being wrong are enormous. The Truscott case became a powerful example of those consequences. A teenager spent decades connected to a crime he was later determined not to have committed in the eyes of the law. At the same time, the victim's family continued to live with the reality that the person responsible for Lynn's death had never been identified. Two separate tragedies existed side by side. The story also changed public understanding of how investigations should be evaluated. It showed the importance of considering alternative explanations. It showed the importance of scientific caution. It showed that expert evidence must be examined, not simply accepted. And it showed that the passage of time can reveal weaknesses in conclusions that once seemed unquestionable. Every generation views history through the knowledge available to it. In 1959, certain forensic conclusions appeared convincing. Decades later, those same conclusions were reconsidered. That does not mean the people involved in the original process had the ability to predict the future. It means that justice systems must remain willing to learn from the past. A case does not become less important because it is old. Sometimes older cases teach the most important lessons. The story of Lynn Harper continues to be studied because it raises questions that extend far beyond one investigation. How do we measure certainty? How do we protect against mistakes? How do we balance the need for answers with the need for accuracy? How do we remember victims while also acknowledging failures within the systems designed to serve them? These questions do not have simple answers. But they are necessary questions. Because every criminal case involves more than a verdict. It involves lives. It involves consequences that continue long after a courtroom closes. Lynn Harper's name remains connected to a tragedy that changed Canadian legal history. Her death led to one of the most controversial prosecutions in the country. The later overturning of Stephen Truscott's conviction became a defining moment in discussions about wrongful convictions. Yet the most important part of the story remains the simplest. A child lost her life. That fact should never disappear beneath debates about evidence or legal procedures. The purpose of remembering cases like this is not only to examine mistakes. It is to remember the people affected by them. The search for truth is often difficult because reality does not always provide the ending people want. Sometimes the evidence leads to a clear answer. Sometimes it leads to uncertainty. And sometimes the most important act of justice is admitting that the answer is still unknown. The case of Lynn Harper remains unfinished. Not because people stopped searching. Not because the tragedy was forgotten. But because, after all the investigations, trials, and reviews, the final piece of the story has never been found. The question remains. And until that question is answered, the story of Lynn Harper will remain one of Canada's most haunting reminders of the difference between believing something is true and proving that it is. Some criminal cases are remembered because of the crime itself. Others are remembered because of what happened afterward. The murder of Lynn Harper belongs to both categories. The death of a 12-year-old girl in 1959 created a tragedy that affected a family, a community, and eventually an entire country. But the decades that followed transformed the case into something larger than a single investigation. It became part of a national conversation about evidence, justice, and the possibility that a legal system can reach the wrong conclusion. The case forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. A conviction does not always mean the truth has been found. A courtroom decision may represent the best judgment possible based on the evidence presented at the time, yet later discoveries can reveal that the foundation of that decision was not as strong as originally believed. That is what made the Lynn Harper case so significant. For years, the conviction of Stephen Truscott was viewed as the final answer. The legal process had been completed. The verdict had been delivered. The punishment had been imposed. But the story did not end there. The passage of time brought new questions. The scientific understanding of forensic evidence developed. The standards for evaluating investigations changed. And the case was examined again with a different perspective. The result was not a new conviction. It was a recognition that the original one could no longer be supported. This distinction became one of the most important lessons from the case. Justice is not simply about reaching a conclusion. Justice is about reaching a conclusion that is supported by reliable evidence. The difference between those two ideas can determine the course of an entire life. The history of criminal justice contains many examples where investigations were influenced by assumptions, incomplete information, or scientific methods that were later reconsidered. The Lynn Harper case became one of the most widely discussed examples in Canada because the consequences were so severe. A teenager had been convicted of one of the most serious crimes imaginable. A child had been murdered. And decades later, the person convicted was no longer considered legally responsible. That left a painful question behind. If Stephen Truscott was not responsible, then who was? The answer has never been established. The absence of that answer is what separates this case from many others. In many wrongful conviction cases, the exoneration of one person eventually leads to the discovery of another offender. In the Lynn Harper case, that final resolution never arrived. The correction of one injustice did not complete the search for justice. It only changed the nature of the search. The focus shifted from proving a conviction to understanding how that conviction happened. The case became a study in the importance of avoiding tunnel vision during investigations. When investigators develop a theory early, there is always a risk that later information will be interpreted through that theory instead of being evaluated independently. This is not a problem limited to one country or one era. It is a human challenge. People naturally search for patterns. They naturally look for explanations. They naturally want uncertainty to disappear. But criminal investigations require something more difficult. They require the ability to remain uncertain until the evidence truly supports a conclusion. The case also highlighted the importance of scientific humility. Forensic evidence often carries enormous influence because it appears objective. Numbers, measurements, and expert opinions can seem more reliable than ordinary testimony. But science itself changes. Methods improve. New research reveals limitations. A conclusion that once appeared precise may later be understood as an estimate rather than a certainty. The reconsideration of the evidence in the Lynn Harper case demonstrated why forensic conclusions must always be evaluated carefully. Evidence is powerful. But evidence must still be questioned. The case also changed the way many people viewed young defendants. Stephen Truscott was 14 years old when he was convicted. The fact that such a young person faced an adult criminal process and a death sentence became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. It forced society to examine difficult questions about punishment, responsibility, and fairness. How should a justice system treat a child accused of a serious crime? What level of certainty should be required before imposing irreversible consequences? How can society protect victims while also protecting against wrongful punishment? These questions remain relevant today. The story of Lynn Harper is therefore not only about the past. It is also about the future. Every investigation, every trial, and every review of evidence carries lessons from cases that came before. The goal is not to assume that mistakes will never happen. The goal is to create systems that recognize mistakes when they do. A justice system is measured not only by how it handles success, but also by how it responds when something goes wrong. The overturning of Stephen Truscott's conviction became an example of that principle. The legal system did not solve the murder. But it did acknowledge that the original conclusion could not remain. That acknowledgement mattered. Because truth requires more than confidence. It requires evidence. And when evidence no longer supports a conclusion, justice requires the courage to reconsider. The case of Lynn Harper remains painful because there is no perfect ending. There is no final courtroom moment revealing the complete story. There is no confirmed identity of the person responsible. There is only a record of what happened, what was believed, what was challenged, and what remains unknown. Perhaps that is why the case continues to capture attention. It represents the uncertainty that exists at the edge of every investigation. The space between what we want to know and what we can actually prove. The name Lynn Harper continues to remind people that behind every case file is a human life. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. Behind every unanswered question is someone who deserves the truth. And although the final answer has never been found, the importance of continuing to search remains. Because justice is not only about closing a case. It is about respecting the truth, even when the truth is difficult, incomplete, or still waiting to be discovered.